Alright, I'm going to start this piece on Strathmore's toned mixed media paper, which means it's 184 pound, similar in weight to Bristol. And the first step is literally just going to darken it a little bit more. I want to introduce a little bit more variety to it. And I'm going to work flat and essentially just throw some water onto the paper so that I can introduce some ink in a wash form with some irregularity. So I got my bottle of India ink right here. Got a little plate. I'm going to drop some of that over here. And see how dark it goes. So it's not super dark. I want a little bit more ink ready to go. And we can obviously see some cool stuff happening immediately. So I want to just kind of let it move around. Sometimes those surprises will add a lot of interest to your piece. And so I'm going to let this essentially just dry. I'm going to do another one down below just in case it ends up too dark. But the same process applies here. Lay it all in real quick. I'm not trying to be too precise about it. This is a study. But even still, the painted quality of this will be something that hopefully add some interest to the picture. Alright, so this is going to dry. I'll come back and continue the process with one more stage. Alright, now that the background is dry, I've taken a sketch here. I have a Siberian Lynx using somewhat of a box approach with construction, symmetry line, understanding the form, kind of a box around the nose. I've given myself a very faint drawing in there, and you can barely see it. But what I'm going to do is take literally pure ink, my Black Star India ink, and I want to paint in that silhouette. So this is about creating a dark mass for our figure against a mid-tone and slightly darker mid-tone background. And then I'm going to introduce the light back into it. So I have a little bottle of ink, so I'm not dipping right into my inkwell. It doesn't have to be perfect. Your edges can be cleaned up with a different pen or a smaller brush even. So don't feel like it needs to get right into a perfect edge. Including the lynx having that really cool hair at the top of its ear, which has a kind of tufted form. I'm going to do that with something different. When I get out here, I've been using an 8. I'm going to switch to this liner brush, which can get you some interesting kind of dry brush texture as it kind of flops around on the surface. So it's about experimentation, trying to find marks that I couldn't have drawn randomly. Let them just happen naturally. Might even rinse that brush out a little bit. Meaning that it's a little looser, a little grayer. And with this same small brush here, I'm going to make some of those tufted strokes, if you will, for the hair at the top of the ear. And I can use this to make a more specific mark along the edge if I feel it's necessary. But for all intents and purposes, that's the end of this stage. And we'll take and give it a few minutes to dry. We'll come back with the next step. Alright, our ink silhouette is dry. And I can take my colored pencils, and I'll have a couple of them, nice and sharp, ready to go. First one is going to be a little more blunt. And I'm going to go in and redefine, or introduce rather, the light. And I have my tracing paper overlay here that I can look at and sort of coordinate where I'm going so it doesn't feel like I'm just making the drawing up. The colored pencil can be somewhat erased, but it is, oftentimes a little more permanent, if you will. The colored pencil is going to go down nowhere near as opaque or bright as like a gouache will, or even a white gel pen in some cases. So if there's a plan, it will be to think of this as a, not the full value range, not from white to, maybe 50%, but rather this doesn't quite get to full white. It does get it a little brighter as I go over the tone paper rather than the black here. But then I will have a gel pen nearby for those really bright highlights. And if necessary, also use my gouache for a couple moments of pure intense highlight or pure intense brightness. But this is the beginning process, and I'll continually go back and forth between this here so that I know, where's that eye? I can go in and kind of coordinate it, make a couple notes, not thinking that it needs to be immediately perfect, but I'll start to go in and rough in some of these brighter moments, looking at where the nose is, a little bit of back and forth. So I'll do this for a few minutes so you can see where it's going, and then I'll take it a little further so this whole process doesn't become too laborious to watch. Nice and bright, receiving some light up here. The Lynx has a nice dark stripe down the ear, but not the whole way down the ear. And I can always go back in and push things darker. But as I'm doing this, because it is more challenging to come back in and lift this out, I'll try to think about what is something that I can put over this whole area that isn't going to disrupt the value. So I want to brighten this all a little bit, but in a gradient. So it gets a little darker right here, where I have the other ear starting to overlap. This isn't going to be pure white. It actually has kind of an orange cast to it. So it won't go pure white. And I don't want it to. Because, again, in this particular case, it's not bright white. Where I might want a little bit more brightness. Some of the interior hairs from the ear get a little brighter. But they also lay on top of something that's not quite black. And so this whole ear can take a little coat initially of the colored pencil so I can navigate where the features are. That the ear becomes something representative of a landmark that I can note and better coordinate, where that eye is. Obviously the drawing here helps as well, but the more landmarks I have as I'm working, the more likely this thing turns out without an eye too low here or there. So the drawing is the guide. I can have my multiple reference images out to look at as well, but if I've made all my decisions in the drawing, I want to use that as the touchstone to say, move away from the reference image just a little bit more and be aware of what choices I'm making. So like this shape for the eye, what shape is that? How is it maybe abstracted or simplified in comparison? And it has the lynx has a stripe of white, kind of goes around the darkness of the recessed eye. But again, because the colored pencil reaches a limit of how bright it can go, if I start to maybe take this area a little bit further, I would certainly be trying to introduce a little bit into the eye so we can see it. We have a pupil in there, and I can always go back in with some ink if I need to, if I accidentally cover something up. So there's a little bit of maneuverability back and forth. But let's see how the gel pen handles here, because the light source is going to be very intense coming from the back. And so I'm going to have a pretty illuminated, very bright moment here. And it's going to feel almost too bright because I haven't done enough in some other areas yet. Typically I wouldn't introduce in this brightness quite yet, but this is a landmark. This is one of the brighter moments. It's around the eye, so I want to gauge that brightness level. Now this is wet. The gel pen is something that if I went back in here and laid this over top, it is more liable to smear. So I do want to be cautious of that. Have a paper towel if you need to nearby to do that. Make sure it's not going to accidentally smear. So you can better see where that is. Maybe make other decisions. So my colored pencil, though, is going to do some other work here. I want to make sure that this is creating some separation of the hair on our symmetry line here. So the whole of this skull gets a little brighter, rolls into some shadow at the top. And as you're feeling more confident about choices you're making, we can go to the sharper pencil here and push in a little bit harder. So really sneak up on it a little bit. before you commit to a final value, before you commit to the exact right shape that you're looking at. And there are moments in here that I'll try and get the gel pen to go back over as well. It should make some marks without any trouble, really. Get that a little bit brighter up there. It even wants to fade into the value. I think that's not a bad thing right now, that's more of a lost edge. I'll even drop some light into the tufts of the fur. Maybe a little bit brighter here on that top of the ear. If this is a little soft right now, I can come back in and with a little bit of ink and sharpen that edge up. So seeing how bright that is allows me to push in a little bit harder here. And it'll come in and allow me to get a little bit more brightness into the eye itself. The eye has a soft edge to the pupil. It's not really sharp and defined. There is a lot of brightness down here. Coloration on the fur changes. It has more of a white underbelly, if you will, to the jaw. But this is again representing something that's not pure white. I'll use the gel pen to get a little bit brighter. This just establishes a little bit more of a local value change, if you will. Alright, so I'll take some time and bring in some other landmarks. This is more of a gray fur here, and it has a gradation down towards the tip of the nose, gets a little bit darker. Not full black, so it should still be receiving some of this brightness. It just again means I can be more confident with that decision and press harder up here so that I get that gradient to flow downward. And our symmetry line, the separation of the fur here, ultimately does transition and eventually fade out into the nose. So I'll be watching the edge there, that I do get some nice fur texture there. I'll go in with the pen and knock in a few of those moments. So it's going to be a little bit of back and forth. Colored pencil and pen. I'll switch to the pen again. It's good to have a little test page for the pen because it'll have a tendency to start and stop on you a little bit. So it's again very bright here. And really around that eye, before I get in there and do something I regret, I'll lay this in there and just make sure I'm in the right page, right spot. Look at the shape going over. And while you're drawing here, I'm drawing on the other side, so the brow goes over. I want to look at what angle that has and make sure again that I'm not putting marks where I don't want them. So slowing down and being present while you're drawing, meaning you're not thinking about something else, you're really trying to be aware of the mark you're about to make next and what that's going to do for the piece. So laying that back over it, it ultimately means I can take the colored pencil a little further over here. Have that test page. Because the waxiness of the colored pencil can be resistant to accepting that colored pencil sometimes. So I like where that placement is. This is just way too high. So that needs to come down. But the colored pencil will take black back over top of it. So if I need to, I can come back in and edit something there. And if you end up losing some of the tooth of the paper, you're not able to get some of the marks to go down on the paper. If you're drawing back into it, hitting this with a little spray fixative, workable fixative, not an acrylic coat or anything like that, but the workable fixative that will give you a little bit more tooth and texture that can grab the colored pencil if you lay that back in. So hopefully you can start to see it shaping up. Still some work to do, certainly. Very bright lights coming from the back. I'll let this fade over with colored pencil in a minute. This is setting up the value change between our light colored fur, the white fur, in the lights, and the white colored fur in the shadow. And sometimes you get lucky with a abstract bleed from a wash like I did in the background. And you can take advantage of something like this bleed right there to almost look like it is fur. Throw some of this back. Let's lay this back over top, see where my line ends here. Just as a landmark, then I'll go in and draw. So it just gets you started. Having something like the overlay with the tracing paper that I'm doing here. When you're laying in that black silhouette, you can overdo it with the ink. There's perhaps a little bit heavier ink in an area or two. It can let or create some resistance rather with the colored pencil. Areas where it's a little thinner, if you want to dilute the black just a little bit with some water, you're going to find that the paper is more present and it's going to grip. And I find that in different areas here where It was a little too much ink, so it's a little thicker, it's a little shinier. It's not going to take the pencil quite as much. So that's why we do these experiments, is to figure out what's too much and what's that Goldilocks amount, just the right amount to allow you to do what you want to do. Alright, so I'm looking for this forehead plane to be nice and bright. Bring the colored pencil in around that nose. Let it curve up and over. So I have that box plane established. This is setting up lighter colored fur in the shadow side. There's a soft transition here where that box is lost a little bit. And that brighter fur pattern around the eye. Rolls down the hill, if you will. Rolls down. At any point, if something feels like it's wrong, take a step back, look at it from a distance, go isolate that one area that might be troubling you and find the solution to it, and then move on to the next thing. Use that spot that you've just corrected to coordinate where the next shape needs to be, or the next brightness, and how that can change the whole thing. But hopefully it starts to look like this lynx that I'm trying to draw. Get that pen started again. This is the fun stuff. The icing on the cake, the highlights are always the moments that start to make the whole piece work. Watch the texture of the fur. Once this is dry, I'm going to hit it with the colored pencil a little bit and see if I can't soften that a little bit. I'm stippling some of the edges here, and I can always go, you can see it's on my fingertip a little bit, kind of smush it around. I'm not smearing it, but just dampening it, if you will. I'm going to be very mindful of how bright I want to make that color in the eye. I don't want it to be pure white because it's got a yellowish cast to it. But it does need to get a little bit brighter. So I'll be looking at that soon enough. The nose has a little bit of a highlight there. So watch the fur pattern and draw some of the patterns that you see. Don't draw it everywhere. If you draw it everywhere, then it loses its impact when you do use it. So be very judicious with all the texture. I'm not going to go in here and draw every piece of fur that I see, every strand. It'll be chaos. It'll be everywhere. I do want this much brighter down here. And I might break out the white gouache soon enough and make some marks with that as well. Just again for some variety. But I'm going to take and Pause this, take it a little further, bring you back in a few minutes. We're watching the sped up version finish this thing out. So rather than making you sit and watch this for 20 more minutes, I've stripped it down and we're continuing the process. I'm going back and forth between the tracing paper to make sure the drawing's clean and bringing the sharpness into focus with that gel pen for increased contrast and shaping out the form a little bit. I'm going to leave some of the black as a shadow side blown out a little bit so as to not over detail the form. It really is going to help accentuate the really bright left side, sort of a mid-tone version in the middle, as we turn over the forehead, and then more of a shadow side on the face as we get closer to us. We're starting to wrap this one up. One of the final things that'll happen, we can bring a pen or you can use your India ink in black with a paintbrush. Come back in, make some final notes, and you'll see that at the last second. Just a little bit of refinement around the eye and the ear to clean some stuff up. And that'll take us to the final piece. So hope you have some fun playing with this approach. Thanks for watching.